So this is going to cover multiple topics within like Google Analytics more so, but we will start with the 5 main areas of how to be a data detective. And I kind of took this from a few different places. This is a really popular diagram that a lot of people use. But really, to be a good data detective, you have to understand the problem you're trying to solve. So a lot of times in the marketing sector, clients come to us and they say, I want to have more people converting on my website, I want more people buying my product, I want more people visiting. So then from there, once you know the problem, you need to come up with a plan, like how you're going to collect this information, what data streams you're going to use. So if somebody comes to you and they say, I want to appear in search results, they may need pay search, sometimes display, and so then you not only have to use Google Analytics, but then you have to use AdWords, sometimes DoubleClick, or maybe even the trade desk, depending on the tool of your trade. So you really need to map all of these things out to completely understand where all you need to collect your data streams. From there, you actually get that data. You collect it all, you manage it, and really once you have a campaign start, you should probably look at it for a couple days after you actually start it. We find a lot of times, especially in medical research, we start a study and then we find we're not collecting all the same information that we'd like to collect. Well, you can't retroactively go back and fix that. So really, if you keep an eye on it as soon as it goes live, you can fix it in the short term rather than waiting until the campaign's ended. We find this happens a lot of times even in research. I mean, we have these whole IRB protocols that we do, we have all this funding, but sometimes if it's not caught in the beginning, we find that we can't really answer what we call aim 1 of our grant. And so you really need to keep an eye on it as soon as possible when it first goes live. From there, once you actually collect the data, that's where you visualize it. So you put it in things like graphs, tables, bar charts, line graphs. So one of the things that I've learned over time is that how I see data is not necessarily the way other people see data, even clients, or in my case would be principal investigators or the PIs in this case. And so a lot of times putting your data in different structures can be really helpful. Think of ink blot tests, right? I mean, no two people see the same thing usually in an ink blot. So data visualizations are the exact same way. So kind of visualizing them in a few different ways and seeing, here's the results that we had, which one of these graphs actually speaks to you in that way will help you get a lot farther, especially with clients. And then you come up with the conclusion of your results. From here, you know, the cycle kind of continues, right? You're refining your campaigns, especially when you're telling the client, it's like, look, we started with this plan. It didn't actually give us the result that we wanted, so we need to start this over again. There is usually a lot of clients don't, or even PIs don't mind you telling them that. There's just a sense of transparency you have to have. And it's just a repeating cycle over and over. But this diagram, even though it's newer, really does follow more of what we would call the scientific method. So the scientific method has been around for a very long time. You know, if you really look at how that diagram was structured, it's very similar to this. The talk I gave last year was about how really studying a disease outbreak is very similar to studying a campaign for marketing. And that still holds true. Jon Snow, who is the father of epidemiology, not the king in Game of Thrones, he actually studied a cholera outbreak in London, and you know, he found that he had to plot all of these different data points on a map to figure out where the originating point was of the outbreak. It's the same thing with the digital campaign. You want to know where it went viral, where it all started. So really, we're all scientists at the end of the day, even though maybe our education background isn't in science, we really all are scientists, and we're all doing science. So what we're going to really focus this talk on today is more about kind of like the problems that you're trying to solve and the common data that you use to try and answer that problem. So a lot of times from a marketing perspective, you're asked, is my campaign working? You know, what are people doing on my website once they come from a paid advertisement, from any paid efforts, things of that nature? Are people actually converting? Are they submitting forms? Are they clicking out to websites? Is my actual investment paying off? Like, how much is it costing that client per conversion that they're having? And then what are you actually doing for me as a company? And so we're going to go over mostly Google Analytics, which is primarily the web analytics platform that so many people use right now because, you know, it's free, it's easy to add on. But honestly, there are so many features of that basic install that a lot of people don't really know underlyingly may not actually fit the goal of their campaign. So misunderstood metrics and settings. So we're going to talk about bounce rate, time on site, time on page, campaign timeout, session timeout, and I was going to talk about user segments and sessions, but that was going to take a little bit more time. So if I'm able to touch on it, I'll try, but I may not be able to get there because I timed it yesterday and it was a little bit long. So we're going to start with bounce rate. So what is a bounce rate? So natively to Google Analytics, this is the percentage of single page sessions, right? So sessions in which the user leaves the site from the landing page without interacting with the page at all, right? But what about your users that click on external links? What if they submit forms on the landing page via a widget and so there's no thank you page that pops up? Or what if they read through an article that's really long and they make it all the way to the end and they do nothing else? If you're sending out e-blasts to newsletter articles, this is okay for users to do. You're trying to train them to do that. In a previous life, at a previous agency, it's a political organization. They used to send out a lot of newsletters, and these sites had high bounce rates, like in the 90s. And they were really concerned about it. But the thing is, though, based on how bounce rate is natively calculated, we said, actually, this isn't a bad thing. You guys are sending out newsletters. 75% of your traffic is coming from these newsletters, and you're dropping them into specific articles. Your users are doing exactly what you want them to do. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. So really understanding how this is calculated and maybe adjusting it towards your campaigns will really help you guys give that added value to the client. And so if you actually adjust the bounce rate, you can control how it's defined. There is nothing wrong with doing this. Google Analytics and Google in and of itself as an organization has a really bad habit of not really putting a lot of this information out there. They kind of give you surface level when you install it. They don't really tell you all the underlying methodologies of how all this data is collected. So a lot of times you have to dig for it. And so with a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, there is a lot of information out there. I'm really just aggregating it all for you guys in this presentation. So that way, for me, I've spent years trying to, basically aggregating all this together. And so hopefully it saves you guys a lot of time and helps you guys really start digging in and being your own data detectives. And so with adjusting some of these metrics like bounce rate, you control it, but then you can also adjust it based on the goals of your website. So we'll go through two examples. So user one, they land on the website and they click out to say a partner site. Again, previous life, we were working with a partner. We built a website for them where we were aggregating all of these different properties throughout Oklahoma City. And one of the main goals that we wanted users to do was to click out to these other areas within Oklahoma City because it was more tourism related. Well, natively, Google Analytics would have counted all of these people as a bounce. So what you have to do in that case is you have to enable outbound link click tracking on the website. And then you also have to make sure it's set up as what we call an interaction event or an engagement hit. That will be talked about a few times throughout this talk. Engagement hits are actually how Google Analytics defines your time on site and your time on page, things of that nature. So if you think Google Analytics looks at your website in page views, that's not really how Google Analytics looks at your website. They look at it as hits of engagement, and you can influence that and change that and modify it based on your needs. And then user two, say they land on the site, they read the entire article on the page, and then they leave the site from that same landing page. In this case, you want to enable scroll tracking on that website. So you want to know that they scroll all the way from the header down to the footer. Now there's some additional tracking you can do. We'll go into a little bit more detail on this a little bit later, but you want to double check that the reader actually read the entire article. So some people, they just take their mouse and they just go, they just go down and up, and so the scroll tracking would fire off for all of those. In this case, you can set up what they call a custom dimension to capture the hit timestamp of when each of those events occurred. So if somebody, they started the page at a minute, they went to the 25% at a minute, like say 25 seconds, and then they went to the 50 at a minute 50, you know that they're actually reading that article. So there's different ways you can actually pull information into Google Analytics and calculate more of engaged users versus people that are just literally browsing. So time on site. Does anybody know how this is calculated in Google Analytics? I know you know, but fine. He happens to be my spouse, so he knows. Yes?
So basically it's the delta between the previous page view and the next page view, and then the minutes to the last one.
Yes. You got very technical with that, thank you. So the high-level definition is, of course you would, is the total time spent on the site divided by the total number of sessions, right? So this is an oversimplification of this metric. It really is, sometimes it makes my eye twitch a little bit sometimes when I look at this, because it really is oversimplifying what this metric actually is. Because at the end of the day, this total number of sessions, this includes people that bounced from your website. So in Google Analytics, if a session bounces, they record that time as a 0. Even if they spent 5 minutes on an article page. If you do not have any other tracking set up, Google Analytics counts every single one of those as a 0. And so that's actually getting included in your total time spent on site, and all of those sessions are in your denominator. So we'll work through kind of an example of this. Say you have 300 sessions, 150 bounces, and the total time on site was 10 hours, 30 minutes. Your average time on site would then be 2 minutes, 6 seconds. So you would take 10 hours, 30 minutes divided by 300, you get an average. Actually, that's supposed to be time on site. Sorry about that, typo. But it's supposed to be 2 minutes, 6 seconds. So do you really want to include all those bounces in your denominator? Maybe, maybe not. We'll actually go through a different calculation of this because there's another time on metric that's calculated very different from this, which is incredibly confusing. So time on page. How do most people probably think this is calculated? If you were to take time on site and think of how time on page was calculated by Google Analytics, inherently you would think it's total time on page divided by total page views based on how time on site's calculated. But it's not. So this is the confusing part. And they do not inherently tell you this in the interface. So time on page is actually calculated as the total time spent on the page divided by total number of non-exit page views. So if a person exited your site from a page, they don't know how long they spent on that page. So it's all 0. But they actually don't include them in this time metric, which is completely opposite of time on site. Does not make any sense. So we'll do an example. Say you had 1,000 page views, 200 entrances, 700 exits. Your total time on page, 5 hours, 12 minutes. Your average time on page would be 1 minute, 2 seconds. So here's the calculation. Now, whenever you would interpret this from the Google Analytics interface, you would say, hey, you have 1,000 page views, and they on average spent 1 minute, 2 seconds on the site. However, because this actually only includes 300 page views, if you were to actually take 1 minute, 2 seconds and multiply it by 1,000, you get 17 hours, 20 minutes total time on page. And so it's somewhat misleading, and it's, granted, it's no error on anybody because Google Analytics just does not tell you this in the interface. I don't know why they don't give like a big, hey, by the way, this does not include your exits, because if you have pages that have high exits, for instance, this time on page is only accounting for 30% of your page views. You could be telling the client that a page is actually getting more engagement than they really are. And so you have to really think about how you're calculating and interpreting these things to the client. And so we're going to look at time on page modified. So if we were to actually take the total time on page and include all of those page views, even the ones that were 0, the average time on page would be 19 seconds versus 1 minute 2. It's a huge difference. So really, neither one of these is wrong. It's just a matter of how you want to tell the client what they're representing. So really, this is representing 30% of their page views. We know 30% of your page views at least spent 1 minute, 2 seconds. We don't know about the other 70% because they decided to leave your page. However, on that exit page, we had outbound links, we had form submissions, something of that nature. You can really tell the client, we're still giving you value, even though from the time on page perspective, it may not look that way. You can include other things like event tracking, things of that nature to actually give them that value. So then time on site. So if we actually calculated this the same way time on page is calculated, where we took out all the bounces, we'd only have 150 sessions included in our denominator. So then it goes to 4 minutes, 12 seconds time on site versus 2 minutes, 6 seconds. Huge, huge difference, right? And again, neither one of those is wrong. It's again how you interpret it. So you just have to really, once you understand the underlying principles of how these things are collected and measured, it really helps you interpret these things a little bit more accurately, and then lets the client know, you know, we can even put more tracking in place for you to get you more accurate measurement. And so that's kind of what we're going to start going through a little bit more of the different things you can kind of modify within Google Analytics. So we're going to look at a time on site engagement example. Now, I went ahead and took some of these examples from other websites because I felt like their visual displays of these were really good, and why reinvent the wheel. So this is an example of how Google Analytics would calculate time on site for a website that had no engagement hits. So say you just added the UA code to the website, right? This visit would have a duration of 10 minutes because you have no other hit happening on that last page. Now, if you were to put, say, event tracking on that website, outbound link clicks, form submissions, things of that nature, this could actually go to 15 minutes instead of 10 minutes. Because say on page 3, that user went and clicked an outbound link or submitted a form. Because you have that engagement information getting collected and you have it specified as an interaction hit, Google Analytics will then recognize that as the final interaction hit and calculate the total time on site based on that. So you can really manipulate how Google Analytics natively captures these things. So time on page. This is an example of how time on page is natively calculated within Google Analytics. You have a session, it has 3 page views, and you can see page 3, even though, this is just an example of, we know they exited at the 50-second mark, so their whole session should be, say, 50 seconds. But because there's no event happening that lets Google Analytics know they exited the site, things of that nature, the time on page 3, you have no idea. It's 0 within the analytics. And your time on site is only 25 seconds because the last hit that it sees is the start of your page 3. So depending on the last page somebody exits from, if it's a long article, if it has a lot of engagement points, you're missing out on so much information. And this is an example of how if you were to put engagement hits on, say, 1 page, and a user's only visiting 1 page, you can actually get better calculations of how long they spent on the page as well as on the site. So this would be an example of somebody putting more like scroll tracking or content area impressions. So say this is the header, the body, and the conclusion of this article. If you actually had those hits getting sent to Google Analytics, they would know, okay, I need to be calculating a difference between each of these hits. Now, you wouldn't know how long they spent between looking at this last piece and exiting the website. However, 5 minutes, 37 seconds is a lot better than 0 at the end of the day. So there's so many ways you can manipulate this. And again, they just don't tell you this inherently. I don't know why that. Oh, this is another engagement example of time on page. So if you actually had, say, the event tracking in place, there's 3 page views, but say you had on page 3 a start and an event at 2:38. This again influences your time on site and your time on page 3. So again, the event hits or the interaction hits that you fire off to Google Analytics really influence all of your general calculations of time on site, time on page, bounce rate, everything. So when I said earlier, talking about calculating a more accurate time on page, this gets a little bit into more advanced kind of tracking that you can do. It's called page visibility tracking. Terry can tell you a lot about this because he's helped set up this tracking for several sites before. But what this does is it actually tells you if a page tab is hidden or visible. So I'm guilty of doing this. I can have 10 different tabs open, but guess what? Google Analytics still has my session timeout window open for all 10 of those browsers. So as I navigate back and forth between, my session's still getting counted no matter what I do. So you can actually set up what's called page visibility tracking. This actually tells you when the browser is when the tab is hidden versus visible to an end user. So this can actually allow you to get some more accurate numbers of how long somebody's on the site. And this is just an example of how it can look in Google Analytics. Honestly, to get this sort of tracking, you need to work with your developers to some extent to help with this. I just happen to live with one, so it's easy for me. But what ends up happening is in the Google Analytics, you get a hidden versus visible event, right? So what you have to do is actually pull this out into Excel to calculate that information. And this is an example of what the individual at Analytics Ninja found. And you can see, he has the total page visibility, but this entry here where it says the total page visibility was 26 hours, 13 minutes, 34 seconds. This is a prime example of where you have to be really careful about how you're defining these things because he did not set a cap on his page visibility. So what happened was he was calculating when somebody left the tab open and they just left their computer, that ticker kept going, right? So you have to set caps. And since he didn't, he was getting inflated numbers. Had this happen in a previous life as well, sliders on a home page, they had events firing off every single time the slider changed, right? Every single time. So guess what? Their average time on site for users was 10 hours. They told the client that. Client was ecstatic. Yeah. Unfortunately, had to burst that bubble. Felt really bad about it, but it was like, well, no, you're just firing off hits that make it seem like the user's actually looking at that content. So you have to be really careful about how often you're firing those things off, what kind of features and functionality you have on that website, and when you actually want to have it fire off and be counted as an interaction hit. So a session timeout in Google Analytics, does anybody know what that is by default? Don't you answer.
30.
It is 30 minutes. So is 30 minutes exactly what you want it to be? So we'll go through two examples that show kind of how that influences your time on site. So for instance, in this case, this visitor viewed 2 pages and had 2 events. Each time that person is doing a different hit, that 30-minute counter resets. Every single time they're doing something, it just completely resets. It's like clockwork, that's what it does. So if you were to have, say, we'll go through 2 examples. This is an individual that went on lunch for 31 minutes. They viewed page 1, they viewed a product page, they left the window open, they went to lunch, they came back. Now, what this example doesn't take into account is that Google Analytics, and this is even more confusing, so I apologize for it, but it's just how Google Analytics is. If this person were to come and spend, like, say, 5-10 minutes on page 2 before they went to page 3, you wouldn't know that based on how time on site's calculated because the new session doesn't actually start until they have a new first page. So it's kind of confusing, right? So if somebody does, say you have an e-commerce website and somebody keeps their product page open, they could come back and continue browsing on that product page for another 10 minutes. You would have no idea they did that because Google Analytics wouldn't start that timer back up until they started a new page. It's very deceiving. Trust me, I've gone through and I pulled this data out and I've calculated it. Like, we've been able to actually add sometimes 5 to 12 minutes on average to a session duration. The odd part is, if you go to, say, the time on page for page 2, you would see how long they spent here and there, but it's not calculated in your session duration. Again, because they calculate and collect these things differently, they just don't say the same story. And it's really confusing because if you were to take, so you would think if I take all the time on page for all these sessions, they would equal the overall time on site, but they won't in this case. You will actually have an inflated time on site, or actually probably a more accurate one. So in this case, this individual just happened to go to add to cart immediately. It starts over a new session because they came back 31 minutes later. However, in this case, it's 29 minutes later. The session persists because your timeout window is 30 minutes, but you have 29 minutes of inactivity. Is that really what you want calculated? Because guess what? Google Analytics is going to say they spent 29 minutes on this page, and that their whole session is actually 32 minutes. It's really not 32 minutes because there was so much inactivity. So you can really influence how this is calculated so that way you can actually, this doesn't happen that often, but depending on the site, especially in e-commerce, this can happen a lot. So what about campaign timeout? Does anybody know the default for campaign timeout? It's 6 months. Yes, I said that right, 6 months, okay? We'll go through a couple of, yeah. I know what you're all like, that's insane, and it is insane in a lot of ways because what campaigns usually last 6 months? They usually don't last that long. There's seasonality to almost every single client out there. So we'll go through a couple examples. Again, somebody already had come up with these figures, and I was like, why not? When we send these out, you'll have all of these references. I'll actually add a few more at the end of this when I send out the final version for some of the other things like the bounce rate, custom dimensions, things of that nature that I wasn't able to cover, so I'll send all that out. But here's an example in Google Analytics. A person comes organically to the site on their first session. The second session, they come direct. The third session, they come direct. What you're going to see in the source medium area of your traffic area is organic, organic, organic. Now, this differs from what you see in the multi-channel funnel reports. I don't know how many people have messed with that area, but multi-channel funnel reports differ from what you see in the Google Analytics interface. It's very confusing. Don't know why they did that. But does anybody know about the multi-channel funnel reports a lot? Like, you can pull the landing page out, but that's all you can get in it. And the landing page actually lives in a separate API or universe than the multi-channel funnel reports. So the only way you can get those two pieces of information together is if you export from the interface. So if you have 50 clients and you're wanting to use that, you have to manually go through and export that out every single month. So a way to prevent you from having to do that is actually modifying your campaign timeout window so it mimics what you're seeing in your multi-channel funnel reports. This allows you to use more of those user-based segments a little bit more real-time, because in the multi-channel funnel reports, that's where you can use like the attributions, your conversions, things of that nature. But you can really mimic that using user-based segments and by modifying your campaign timeout. That will probably have to be a talk for another day, but that's ways you can modify that. Here's another example. If a person comes to the site directly for their first visit, that does not get overwritten. In Google Analytics and the Google universe, direct is like the low man on the totem pole. Organic, referrals, campaign information, all of those are above a direct session. So in this case, this person came direct first, then organic, then direct third. So it would show up as direct, organic, organic. But you're still not seeing that you're creating kind of a repeat customer in some ways. That comes directly and not through your organic search results. Here's another one. So they came organically, then they came from a referral, then they came from direct. Because a referral and organic are on the same level in the hierarchy, that goes ahead and resets that campaign timeout. And so now they're going to be seen as a referral until another kind of so-called level shows up in the hierarchy at the same level. And here's kind of a calendar example. I really like this because it really kind of shows you what it looks like. This user had a visit on January 1st. So they came through organically. It's recorded as organic. but then their next visit comes through on July 2nd. That's past the 6 months, and they come directly. That's actually going to get counted as direct because guess what? It's past the 6 month timeout window. So you're actually seeing more of an accurate picture of what they're doing. However, it's more confusing. You have a visitor come on January 1st. Say they come again on April 4th. It's direct. So that gets recorded as organic. Guess what? Google Analytics has now started that 6 month timeout window again on the 4th of April. So then they have another 6 months. It's a volatile cycle. It just keeps resetting over and over again. And so that's why a lot of times where you try to actually mirror what you're seeing in Google Analytics to say Google Search Console, Google AdWords, or display, those numbers will not match because of situations like this. So you really have to think about if you're trying to get a one-to-one match, you really have to reset all of these parameters in order to get a one-to-one match. And you can do that. There's nothing wrong with doing it. Google actually encourages people to do it, but they just don't tell you to do it. They don't want to be held liable because really at the end of the day, because it is mostly a free tool, any modifications you make to it, you're responsible for it. So that basically takes them out of being liable for anything that you do, but there really isn't anything wrong with it. It's the best thing I can encourage is don't be afraid to modify things and test them out. A lot of times when we would set up analytics tracking on a website, we would always create what we would call kind of a basic account that just literally had the UA tag, so only page views. So the client could see, if you only had a UA tag, this is all you would see in that account. Then we would set up more of an kind of advanced account. So that way they can see, look, because of all this additional tracking, look at where your bounce rate is at. Look at the time on page we can give you. And that kind of shows added value of what you're able to give that client. And when you set up those tags, I know a lot of people will say, oh, it's going to slow the site down, things of that nature. The basic tag really doesn't do that, especially if you're using Tag Manager and you're firing off all the tags through Tag Manager. It really won't slow down the site. Really big images, things of that nature will actually kind of mess up the site a little bit more than a little bitty tag. And so I was going to go through some demos, but there wasn't time to do that because I see it's 9:41. So maybe another time, perhaps a more hands-on session. I'd love to take you guys through some of these tools because I started out being an epidemiologist. Okay, my degree is in epidemiology. I study now, I'm doing biomedical research. That's where my field started. The reason why I was able to make the transition over to marketing so well is because, again, the data science kind of realm follows the scientific process so well. It's a one-to-one. You just have to be able to see where term A equals term A here. And that's really all it is. And so really since I started this, there have been a couple tools that I really used a lot. Next to Analytics, it's a fantastic tool. They have a free trial for like 2 weeks. If you want to have an individual license, it's $40 a month after that. They have some deals if you get multiple licenses. But this allows you to pull from Google Analytics API, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, AdWords, and you can actually pull from not only the public interface, but also the more private-facing interface. So I don't know if a lot of people know this, but YouTube and Facebook have like a public-facing API, but then the private-facing. So you can pull a lot of information off of somebody else's YouTube or Facebook page if it's a public page. You can basically spy on your enemies or your competition. Sorry, that's a more delicate word. If you want to, by using the public-facing APIs for things like YouTube and Facebook, you can see how are my competitors posting? How often are they posting? What's really engaging with their content? You can do all of those things. There's so much out there publicly that people just put out there for you to just grab. And so Next Analytics is a great tool to kind of use from a beginning standpoint if you don't know how to build your own API calls. The next one is Search Analytics for Google Sheets. Now this is a great add-on for Google Search Console. So I don't know if a lot of people know, but Google Search Console only keeps your data for 90 days. That's not a lot, because especially if you have a client that you're retaining for years, you want to go back and see how their search history had changed. But if you're not pulling down this information from the API, it is lost forever. So Search Analytics for Google Sheets, it's a free add-on you can add in your Google Drive to the same account you have your Search Console access. You can actually you can set up queries so that on the third day of every month, it's pulling down that information constantly for you. So it's like you don't even have to think about it. It's there, ready for you, always waiting. Some other tools for data analysis collection. R is a really popular tool. It's free. R Studio is actually the IDE client, so it's a more friendly user interface, I guess is the best way to put that. And so R can connect to different APIs, things of that nature. I've actually ran scripts through R where I connected to Google Sheets in Google Drive and actually systematically pulled down the Google Search Console information month over month without ever having to open up Google Drive and download those manually. So there's great ways you can set up automation. R is a great introduction to being able to set these things up. SaaS, it's not software as a service. There's a lot of things called SaaS out there. This is statistical analysis software. This has been around for a very long time. They actually have what's called the University Edition. I love this because previously you would have no introduction to SaaS unless you were going to school for statistics or biostatistics or epidemiology. There's no way most lay people would ever have experience with this because a base license for this costs 10 grand just for the first year. So this actually gives people the opportunity to have experience with it. It's supposed to be where you do nonprofit work, things of that nature. They have all kinds of test data sets you can use, but you can download this and you can actually start programming in SAS. You can write HTML, SQL code, JavaScript. I mean, it reads all kinds of languages. It's one of my favorite tools. I use it all the time. It's been the tool I've used since graduate school. It's amazing. And so I was really happy to know that they made this kind of free for everybody to download and kind of experiment with it. And then for data collection, has anybody heard of PWIC? I know you guys have. This little group over here. So actually So PWIC is an open source web analytics tool. Honestly, I think that's where web analytics is going for the future. Google Analytics is great. You're still going to have it. It's a supplement to more open source tools. PWIC actually collects IP addresses, so you can see it in the interface. You can collect identifiable information and pull it down. Now, because this is open source, all right, there are caveats to this because it's a self-hosted solution, so you set up all the data security, you set up the server, things of that nature, but depending on the type of client you have, this can be really helpful to have that information. It's really good to work with your dev team on this. That's the reason why I've been able to set it up in the past, is working with the dev team because there is a lot of dev work that goes into kind of setting up these more sophisticated data collection methods and tools. A couple of popular tools that I use from the Chrome extension. Google Tag Assistant, if anybody's heard of that, it's a really nifty tool. You'll just add it to your Chrome extension. It tells you what kind of tags are firing off on your Google Analytics, whether or not they're happy or very angry. They're literally faces that go from blue to red. Actually, no, they go from green to red. It's amazing. But it tells you if the tags are actually firing off successfully, and you can actually record the information that's firing off on that page. So say you're getting a new client and you want to know, they say they have everything set up correctly. Guess what? You can use this to actually make sure it's firing off appropriately. And it's free and it's on there. There's nothing gray area about any of these. It's all white, don't worry. Because you have people are like, is this the gray area or am I going into the crazy trackable dark web area? No, these are fine. These are all considered great. James, it's more of an SEO tool, but this actually gives you, fires off all the tags, but it tells you also SEO information at the same time. So I find I run Google Tag Assistant and James at the same time and just kind of look at the information I'm getting from both. Because James will actually tell me about tags outside of Google's realm that are firing off. So like Facebook, Trade Desk, things of that nature, even PWIC. Tag Manager, I forgot to correct the spelling. So Tag Manager, Injector. This actually allows you to inject Tag Manager onto a website. Sounds hackish, I know, but it's legitimately there. It works, no problem. You're allowed to do this. Say you're getting a new client, again, they say their tracking is in order. You can actually go in and you can check if we were to set up tracking, how it would fire off and legitimately show them. Because if you set up, say, kind of a test property that's just bucketing information from that test container, you could say, here's what you have, but here's what you could get if you let us set this up for you. So you can really use that tag manager injector to your advantage. The last one is built with. This is a website you can go to, or you can actually add it as a Chrome extension. When you're on a website, if you have this Chrome extension added, you just pull it up, it tells you the CMS. Not always, because if it's a small CMS, if it's not a very popular one, it won't tell you. But again, that's a red flag to, okay, we're gonna have some problems, some challenges. But generally it will tell you if it's on WordPress, things of that nature. It will also tell you if there are other properties using the same UA tag. So in Google Analytics, the structure of the accounts is you have UA-12345-1, right? So the 12345 represents the account, the -1 represents the property. A lot of times when other web vendors will build within a vertical, they'll bucket everybody under the same account. So all of their clients will have 12345-1, 12345-2, so on and so forth. I think the cap is at, do you know the cap?
What's the 20 or 100?
I think it's 100. So there's like a cap of 100 on the number of properties you can have under a single account. That's kind of scary because then all of that information's held in one account. And so that's another way you can look at it and easily tell a client, it's like, your analytics are getting bucketed in with all of these other properties, and they set you up, they didn't give you a custom setup necessarily, they gave you a custom setup that they're giving everybody else. And so that allows you the opportunity to say, hey, we can actually do a little bit more for you. And the thing is though, I will give this side note because it's something recently that Google Analytics did. When I say recently, I think it's within the last 1 to 2 years. If you ever run into a vendor that tells a client, I can't give you that analytics property because it's under one main account, that's a lie. Because in Google Analytics, there's a way, when they're an admin under that property, they can move it out to a new account. So even when web vendors are saying all working in one vertical, they can give a client their actual historical web analytics. Find that happens a lot of times. It's really nerve-wracking because technically Google doesn't like when people do that. I really feel like it goes severely underreported to Google. So if you ever run into that situation, I'll put that reference when we send out the final slides to that because it's an awesome feature and the client could then send it out to their current web vendor if they try to say, well, we can't give you that history. So just a couple of, I love memes, GIFs, however you want to call it. Really from being a data analyst, data detective, data scientist, research biostatistician, however you want to call yourself, really at the end of the day, you need to see the forest for the trees, but in the same perspective, you need to see the trees for the forest. You have to be able to hyper-focus, but then make your view a little bit wider at the same time. You have to be able to see both. You have to be flexible, depending on the need that's going on, the timelines you have to deliver, and really at the end of the day, caveating things, putting disclaimers on them are really what's going to save you at the end of the day. I mean, scientific papers have those all the time. If you watch those, those commercials for all of those drugs that they come up with, there's like all this fine print down there that nobody can read. But guess what? They're fine, like legally, they're covered. And so having those disclaimers, leveraging those a bit more can be really helpful, especially when somebody's like, I want this now, I want you to rush it, disclaimer everything. You can make it really tiny to where they have to read it with like a little magnifying glass, but hey, you're covered. Sherlock Holmes, I love the Sherlock show on BBC, one of my favorites. I love the Mind Palace, it's one of my favorite things. And so to a great mind, nothing is little. Really, at the end of the day, track everything that you can. Sometimes, you can attest to this, there were sometimes on websites that there were some features that everybody internally thought, nobody's going to interact with this. Surely nobody's touching it. And so a lot of times from, and no offense to devs, okay, a lot of times people are like, oh, it's not worth to adding that, that's just extra work. And I was like, well, can we add it so I can actually make a data-driven decision on that design element? Data-driven decision making is kind of that buzz thing that everybody's doing. And so when we've added that in cases, we've been proven wrong, that users were interacting with features that we internally never thought people would use. But then again, we're not the end users. We're not the mass public. So really making sure that you take your own bias and opinions out of it and track everything so that you can make those data-driven design decisions as well. Because at the end of the day, there's no reason why, especially on a website, if you're building a new one, that you shouldn't be able to go ahead and add tracking elements to what's already there. Even if you're only able to get tracking for a week or 2 weeks, being able to add all this additional tracking so you can tell the client, it's like, I know you really want this, and I know it looks really pretty, but I'm sorry, nobody else likes it. And if you're able to put that data in front of them, a lot of times they'll go along with you. Sometimes no, but again, that's where disclaimers come in. You say, okay, well, we've told you that this is not an engaging element. You have them legally sign off on it, and they're held liable, and they can't actually hold you accountable anymore. Ada Lovelace is one of my idols in time. I don't know if anybody knows who she is. Well, you guys know, you're people. She's considered the first individual that kind of came up with the concept of a computer being able to go through algorithms and things of that nature. She's kind of the mother of computer science in some ways. And so this is one of my favorite quotes. And really what it says is that at times, a lot of people will tell you that, and I've dealt with this throughout my career that spans a very long time. I don't want to say how long because then it makes me feel old. But, a lot of people don't always see the picture that you're seeing as the analyst or the person trying to put together the tracking. They don't say, oh, well, I don't need that. I don't know how many times, especially from a research perspective, that a lot of people don't think, oh, I don't need to collect this on my study participants. Well, guess what? They should have. And so we've collected over half of them. And so guess what? We only have half of that information. And so that makes the power of our analysis smaller, the significance of our findings less. Same thing in marketing. So really, and this may sound a little bit negative, but at times, as an analyst, I have not always been the most liked person because I say things about, I tell the truth about things that people have spent months on, right? So when people make very pretty videos or campaigns and things of that nature, if it wasn't engaging, you have to tell people bad news. At the end of the day, you kind of become a little unpopular at first. Over time though, as people start getting that information, you say, hey, but guess what? How about we try this? Offering them some suggestions of how to change what they do. You'll become a little bit more liked. I had to do this when I used to work at OU. I had to work through the people that did the scheduling, to the billing, to the inpatient entry, to the electronic medical records. None of those people liked each other. They did not talk to one another, but I was tasked with making a data set that combined everything. So I had to get each of those people to like me. It took over a year to get everybody to be okay and open to me pulling my own information, sharing with them, because I would find some issues with the data entry or some areas where we could have gotten more billing. It's just part of the job. But be persistent, because remember, be confident in what you're doing. Even though others may not necessarily be happy with you in that moment, it will pay off. The last thing is education never ends. Watson, it is a series of lessons with the greatest for the last. This is actually in Sherlock. Author Conan Doyle put this in his book, but I find that one of the things that has made me most successful as a data analyst, biostatistician, whatever you want to call me, there's so many different names, but really is just because I have a degree in something, a certification, I never stop learning anything, because this field is changing too quickly to stop learning. So staying up with everything is the way to go. And here are a couple blogs. And again, those will all be in there, but I actually wanted to show you guys something from a personal perspective that I use to kind of keep up with everything. Has anybody heard of RSS feeds? So I use a tool called Feedly. There's several out there, but this is my own personal Feedly. I literally put all of those 4 blogs you've seen, plus many other things, within this one area. So today, I can see all of this information about advertising, analytics, Amazon Web Server, big data, blogs, business. I gotta add the comics. You gotta have some fun stuff in there. You do data science. So you can literally add all this kinds of information in there where you can pull it up on your phone. I mean, I have a career. I'm also a wife. I'm also a mother to a daughter of 6. And so I don't have a lot of time to go through all these websites and see all these different things. Things like these RSS feeders will save you so much time and give you so much information on the go. You can flag it for later. I pay for the pro version of this. It's like $45 a year. But honestly, it really helps if you're trying to stay up with so many different things. You can feed it all in there and you get it on your phone, tablet, computer, whatever. And so just wanted to share that from a personal perspective on, I mean, I don't consider myself an incredibly intelligent person. I just happen to be very resourceful and maybe it's sometimes a little lazy. So I try to, do things in a little bit of a smarter way, not a harder way. And so this has been one of the things that I've used over time that's really helped. So that is the end. I'm sorry, I'm almost at 10. That went longer than I thought. But there we go.